sight of heaven, it is just a very comforting thought. And many of the members of the church of my youth were very poor by the standards of our government and our Western economy. I grew up in Sunflower County, Mississippi, one of the poorest counties. And the church that I went to had so many people who faced real challenges in securing daily sustenance and support that we often take for granted. I'm talking about having enough food, having affordable housing, having quality, affordable health care, access to health care. And we knew when members of our church were going through a particularly tough time because they would share some of their story during testimony service. And if someone did not want to share the exact particulars of their troubles, they would sing songs in praise and worship, which would reveal the depth of need, despair, and anxiety that they were experiencing. In a word, they would tell us about their wilderness wanderings at that moment. And as I read this account of Israel's wandering in the wilderness and God's provision of manna, I recalled the song that most of those faithful but poor people would sing. They would often sing a song popularized by James Cleveland, the famed gospel singer, who sang, "I don't feel no waist high. I come too far from where I started from. Nobody told me that the road would be easy. I don't believe God brought me this far to leave me." No matter what the situation was, no matter how desperate they were, in the midst of need, despair, and anxiety, these were a people of God who trusted even when there was no evidence to suggest that they should, but they trusted that the wilderness in which they found themselves was not their destination, that the wilderness was not a permanent condition. Unfortunately, this was not the response of the people of Israel. Oh, they had been delivered from bondage and oppression in Egypt. And 45 days into the new life, 45 days into their new life, they found themselves in the wilderness without food. And on their trek to the land that God will show them, they find themselves in just wilderness physically and spiritually. We're just bland and dead, and we're hungry. I have a friend who said he's hangry. It's not going to work. And without food, it's true, they are hungry, they are scared, they are desperate, things are uncertain. And so they complain and they grumble. And oh, I tell you now from experience, if you are a leader, they're going to complain when they get hungry. And so they said, "It would have been better, Moses, if you left us to die in Egypt. Because at least there we had meat all the time and all the bread we could eat. But you brought us out here to die. We should have stayed back where we were." Yeah, they were asserting that it is better to be enslaved and full than to be free and hungry. I want to test that. In their need, in their despair, and their anxiety, they forgot what life was like in bondage. They misremembered who they were in Pharaoh's land. In Pharaoh's land, they were slaves. They forgot about that. They romanticized what it was like to struggle for food. They forgot that it was God who carried them through the sea. They doubted the promise of a land flowing with milk and honey, and they thought right then and there that the wilderness, this hard time, this rough challenge, this place of dark and death, they assumed that this was their destination, that this was their permanent condition. And as one of the commentators so aptly described, a food crisis can lead to a faith crisis. And that'll make you complain. But God didn't even wait to hear from Moses about the complaining. God heard the complaints of the people and tells Moses, I'm going to rain down bread from heaven. And I imagine that Moses wondered, what does that mean? What does it mean? We're in the wilderness. There's nothing around us. What does it mean? But God said, I'm going to rain down bread from heaven. But here's the thing, whether we know what that means or not, over and over again, God reminds Moses and the people that God sees the misery of the people. God hears the cries of the people. God knows their suffering. And here in the middle of wilderness, amid their complaints, 4 times we are told that God hears. That God hears. Oh, I forget that sometimes too. Sometimes I repeat in a prayer something 5 or 6 times, and it doesn't occur to me that maybe God already knows. Yes, son, I do talk a little too much in the prayer. But God hears, and here's how we know that God hears, because God is responsive and generous to them. No one had to make the case for what we need. God knows already. So God gives them manna, a sweet, edible substance issuing from a desert plant, and meat from quail that is migrating across that region. They have access to birds to eat. God gives them bread from heaven, food found right in the place where they were complaining. Right in the place they were complaining about, food is there. Oh no, let me disabuse you of a notion. This wasn't supernatural. We spiritualized this. We over spiritualized this thing. This wasn't supernatural food. There wasn't anything that said was a miracle. No, it was food right in the place where they were standing. Let me spell it out a little bit clearer. Sometimes when you're complaining, you can't see the blessing. And so right there, food is right there. The place that they're complaining about, it's there. And here's an even more beautiful thing about it. All they need to do is take what they need. And they don't have to give up any day of rest. For the bounty, God gives them enough to eat, so there is no worry or anxiety about where the next meal is coming from. This isn't a place of death and emptiness after all. Now, this wilderness has been transformed in the very presence of God. God can transform wildernesses. Oh, I wanted you to clap on that, but I'll say it differently last time. This place, which seems dead and fruitless, is where God's abundance and God's gift of daily bread will be realized. They do not even have to toil for it. They do not have to work their fingers to the bone like they had to do back in Egypt to get just a morsel of food. And they do not have to fear that there will be enough for tomorrow. Everyone had enough of what they needed to be sustained and satisfied. No more, no less. Do you know what kind of economy we could live in if that's the way everyone had it? Do you know how wonderful life could be if that's the way we lived every single day, everyone having enough? God is saying something to the people in the wilderness. I got an economy that can work for everybody. Oh, but they almost missed it. They almost missed it. In the complaint, they almost missed it. Oh, but it's a beautiful economy. I wish I could live in it. You know someone's going to call me a communist after I say this. But anyway, nobody had more than another. Nobody would or could exploit another because of unequal distribution of the manna and the meat. The bread of life is not a commodity to be hoarded and exchanged like a trinket or an iPhone. God takes care of God's people. And so while they were pining for life back in Egypt, they failed to understand that they are no longer slaves and subjects of the empire. Oh, some people call it oppression sickness, when you can't forget where you've been so that you can't live and go where you're supposed to go. But they were pining back for Egypt. And they didn't understand that they were no longer slaves by God and their deliverance from bondage. They are now, I love how they said in Exodus, they didn't even call them a nation. They didn't even call them a people. They called them a congregation. Already changed their identity. You are the people of God. You belong to God. You are no longer slaves. You are no longer laborers. You are not just some people out there. You're not just some nation. You are a congregation. You are God's people. You are related to the one who will feed you in the wilderness. Oh, their hunger is real. We can't blame them for that. Their hunger is real. But unfortunately, sometimes when we're hungry, when we're desperate, we fall back on what is familiar and ultimately what is counter to what God calls us to be. And here's the test for this congregation. Will they hoard what God freely gives? Will they privatize the natural bounty of creation for personal gain? Will they fight over what God shares with all equally? Will they trust God to provide them enough for today? Or are they going to worry about tomorrow? Long enough, you will spend time in somebody's wilderness. I don't care if the last 3 years have been Shangri-La, have been a big celebration. In the near future, there may be a wilderness awaiting us. But my hope is that no matter how hard it gets, that we reflect on the surprising ways that God feeds and sustains us in the midst of our wilderness wanderings. I hope we remember that we are not what the world tells us that we are. We are not just consumers or laborers or poll-tested voters. We are the people of God. We are divine substance. God breathed the very breath of life into us. And so we're not just these things that the world puts us on a board and say that we are. We are a congregation. And I'm not just talking about all God's children. I'm talking about anybody who finally wakes up and says, oh my God, I belong to God. I belong to God. On this journey, there will be needs, there will be despair, there will be anxiety. And sometimes it will be acute and it will be debilitating. And here's the thing. I'm talking about the people complaining, but I'm not asking you not to complain. And the reason I can't ask you to do that because I'm going to complain probably in the next 2 hours. But I'm not even asking you not to complain. But what I am asking us to do is that when we find ourselves in that place, we find ourselves where the need and the anxiety is so deep, that we don't look back to our places of bondage, that we don't look back to the places where we once languished without much of a future. And I don't want us to look back and say, I wish we had stayed. Oftentimes we hear the conversation, especially about LGBTQ people, and again, I'm guilty of it too. We talk about how it used to be. We say, oh, we used to go to the club and we would dance all night, and we used to do this and we used to do that, and we used to do that, and now it just seems like but we don't want to go back. We don't want to go back. The challenges that we have as a people who are a little bit freer cannot be compared to the struggle of life in bondage. Let's not misremember how hard it was. Let's understand that the wilderness that we're going to confront this day is not the destination. The wilderness is not a permanent condition. Oh, yes, I know. Someone would say to me, but Pastor, some of those people that Moses talked to, some of those people that ate that manna, they died in that wilderness. But God. We're talking about them now because they got on the other side of the wilderness. Wilderness is not a permanent condition. It's not the end of the story. God sees our misery. God hears our cries. God knows our suffering. And God promises to rain bread down on us to satisfy us. And the presence of God will change wilderness into a place of abundance. I believe it. I know it. I see it. I experience it every day. And there is just simply no doubt that wilderness will also bring us to a point where we may have a crisis of faith. That the journey on which we have been called is winding too long in the wilderness. Yes, this is what the complaint. I just go ahead and say it. God is taking too long. It's all right. God can handle it. Trust me. I know because in the psalm they say, it's taking too long. You're too slow, God. This hunger is too much. There will be times when we will question even if we can get through the ordeal or the crisis. There will be times when the trial will be so much. And even now, even as a nation, we are trekking through wilderness. Hurricanes, mass shootings, deportations, a rollback in civil and human rights for some very vulnerable people. All of that is happening. This is a wilderness. And boy, yeah, I tell you, I have to catch myself on Facebook because Facebook is a great facilitator for complaining. If you having trouble complaining, spend time on Facebook. Not permanent. Trust that isn't the final destination. That even in this wilderness of our nation, that there is a brighter day ahead. And there is no going back. I don't believe God brought us this far to leave us. I don't believe God brought us this far to leave us. Whatever you're going through right now, wherever you are on your journey, I do not believe God brought you here to this point to leave you. Even if it doesn't look good in the next day or weeks or months, I just simply do not believe that God brought you this far to leave you behind. Don't be afraid. I just do not believe it. I do not believe that God brought you all this way from everything that you've been through, from everything from the addiction, from the sickness, from the failure, from the disappointments, from the crying, and from the hurt. I don't believe that we're able to sit here this day only to be left alone any further. So hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Because God is faithful and just. God sees, hears, and knows it all. And you don't have to worry. You don't have to be ashamed about it. You don't have to be afraid about it. God did not bring us this far to leave us. Amen.